Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. Lots of turkey and cranberry sauce and other things that make you happy. But here we are back for our last week of the term. Boy, it's going fast. Please don't forget, problem set number 6, due on Thursday. So it's up there. And hopefully you all got my email message about the typo in the first multiple choice question. So I haven't fixed it and reposted it, so make sure that you know that it's 3 baht per rupiah rather than 3 rupiah per baht. Today, as long promised, we're going to talk about a different way of thinking about expectations. So notice that in our standard short-run aggregate supply curve, the assumption that we've always made is that we've had a one-period adaptive process, so that expected inflation was always equal to the prior year's actual inflation. Well, today we want to relax that assumption and look at an alternative and see some of the things that would be different once we start assuming alternatives. But before we jump into that, I want to remind you that 2 weeks from today, your final exam in this course will be over. Because 2 weeks from today, from 11:30 to 2:30, is exam number 3. We'll be taking that exam in Wheeler Auditorium, and that exam will cover the material that we have talked about since exam number 2. So that is, in essence, chapters 13, 16, 17, 21, which we're covering today, and the epilogue, which we will cover on Thursday. So it's not a lot of material, although there are lots of fun things inside of those chapters. And, of course, you can't forget your basic aggregate supply and demand model, because all of these are basically built on top of that. The format of the exam will be exactly the same as the first 2 exams. There will be 10 multiple-choice questions and 2 free-response analytical questions. The structure of the exam will look exactly the same, but you do have 3 hours to take the exam, because that's the university requirement. That doesn't mean you have to be there for all 3 hours. If you finish early, you can leave early. My hypothesis, though, is a number of you will still be there at 2:30, working busily away. That, by the way, is a expectation based on adaptive expectations, because in the past, there have always been students at the end of the 3 hours still working on the exam. So adaptive expectation sometimes is very valid. If you want to prove it breaks down this go-around, the GSIs in particular would be happy to accommodate you on that. So anyway, today, I'll talk more about the exam on Thursday, but for today, we want to talk about expectations. So we've been talking about adaptive expectations, so now we want to investigate a little bit about something known as rational expectations. And then we need to talk a little bit more about monetary policy in particular in terms of how policy should be determined. That is, what kind of policy should we actually be implementing? We've already talked about the Taylor rule, but we want to open that discussion up a little bit further to talk about rules versus discretion in a much more general way. And then we'll also see that, especially with rational expectations, that the credibility of the policymakers turns out to be very important in terms of how the economy actually functions. So we'll look at that as well. So as you remember, adaptive expectations are always based on historical information, right? It's what's already happened in the past. So an adaptive expectation applied to the San Francisco Giants in baseball would say, the Giants won the World Series in 2010. They won the World Series again 2 years later in 2012. They won the World Series 2 years later in 2014. So adaptive expectations would say we should expect them to win it again in 2016. Right? Just based on history, we can have those expectations about what's going to happen. Now, the alternative, or a alternative to adaptive expectations, is something that is known as rational expectations. Rational here is a mathematical term, not a psychological term. So math versus psychology. So in this case, rational expectations do use information from history. The Giants won the World Series in 2010, 12, and 14. But it also uses all available information to make its forecast or expectations about the future. So it might also say, yes, but one of the key players, Pablo Sandoval, is no longer with the Giants, and that's going to make a huge difference. We still don't have a left fielder who's going to play every deal. So we need to know who that's going to be. I need to have some ideas about who that's going to be. What's the pitching staff going to look like? Okay, we got Mad Bum in there. We got Timmy Lincecum, who's been up and down. We got Matt Cain coming off of elbow surgery. Who are the other 2 pitchers going to be? We're not quite sure. By the way, the other 3 pitchers for the Giants this season are all free agents. So in order to make an expectation, a rational expectation about the Giants in 2015 or 16, we want to use all the information that's available about the team. Right? Now, it turns out that rational expectations are also thought of as optimal forecasts. Now, what we mean by optimal here is that they will, on average, be correct, but only on average. It also means that when they are incorrect, the errors, the forecast errors, are randomly distributed. So rational expectations actually don't ever have to be actually true. They only have to be true on average. The error terms, the forecast errors, are randomly distributed. Okay? So sometimes we might forecast above, sometimes we might forecast below, but on average, all of those misses should cancel each other out. Now, the key question, though, is do people, either individuals as consumers or business people, actually form rational expectations? There is clearly an advantage to doing so. Right? Using all the available information that there is, we can probably make a better forecast of the future than only by using historic information. So there's clearly a payoff, a beneficial payoff, to having rational expectations. On the other hand, there's also a cost associated with coming up with rational expectations. So suppose I said the following. The economy starts in general equilibrium, and now it experiences a positive aggregate demand shock. We all know what's going to happen. Even with adaptive expectations, we know what should happen in our standard model. Right? Economic output should rise, inflation should rise, the adjustment process will come about, inflation will go even higher, economic output will move back to potential. How many people do you think actually know that that's how the economy self-corrects? We have a population of this country of 315 million people. Right? How many of those 315 million people know that that's the way the economy works? Right? But knowing that and making rational forecasts of what inflation is going to be requires actually knowing something. Right? You have to have some time in your life probably thought about or studied macroeconomics. And after studying it, you actually have to remember it. Like 6 months from now. Or 6 years from now. So there's time and effort, maybe some money that's involved in actually acquiring the information that's available and trying to fit it into a framework that allows you to make some sort of educated estimate of what's likely to happen over time. Because there are costs as well as benefits, the costs suggest that most people probably don't form rational expectations. Especially don't form rational expectations about things that are far into the future. I'm not even sure about in the short run. I don't know how many of you drive, but I'm always intrigued, especially when I'm on the freeway and I see that one person who's driving really fast, changing lanes, trying to get ahead of everybody, and he'll get into a lane, or she, I don't mean to be gender biased here, he or she will get into one of those lanes where there's a big open stretch, and then of course there's a stack of cars in front of that, and they'll go racing down that lane, and then all of a sudden you see the brake lights come on, right? How many of you have seen that? It happens over and over again. Didn't this person driving really fast down the road, couldn't they see that there were cars going much slower? Didn't they know that they were going to have to slow down? Why didn't they slow down much sooner? Right? There's a cost associated to the wear and tear on the brakes, by the way, of driving that way. So being able to push this all together probably suggests that while rational expectations is great, there are lots of situations in which rational expectations don't seem to hold very well. Now, to the extent that rational expectations do hold, however, there are three important things that we can say. One is expectations that are rational use all available information. Again, both history as well as what's currently happening. So that also means that rational expectations should be built into or will be affected by any changes in policy announcements. Second, because rational expectations already include historic information as well as current information, they will change only if new information becomes available. Notice that is not the way that adaptive expectations work. Right? In our adaptive expectations model, what happened to expected inflation depended only on history. As history changed, our expectations changed. In rational expectations, as history changed, nothing happens to rational expectations. It needs to be new information. And then finally, if the way that a variable changes gets altered, then the expectations of that variable and how that variable changes will also be altered. So let me give you an example. In the current environment, one of the things that we have seen over the last 4 years is that the unemployment rate has come down faster than almost anybody had expected. So if you went back to 2010 when the unemployment rate was up around 10%, it's come down to 5.8% now. Now we have a lot of information about what's happening in the labor market and the economy in general. Right? If you remember Okun's law, we have a relationship between the unemployment gap and the output gap. Well, we've also seen what's happened to real GDP growth. That is, we can measure what's happening to the output gap. The unemployment gap, though, has come down much faster than Okun's law would suggest. So we now have the behavior of the unemployment rate changing, and that, of course, means that our expectations of the unemployment rate should also change. So again, change the behavior of a variable, you'll change the expectations about how that variable actually behaves. Now, let's think about it something slightly different, and we'll come back to rational expectations in just a minute. And one of the things that we need to think about is how policy, monetary policy in particular, but this could also be applied to fiscal policy, how it should actually be implemented. Should we have a rule that tells us how to respond, policy response to certain situations, or should we simply leave policy response up to the policy makers? Use your discretion. Use your best judgment about what should happen. And we can think about those two as kind of the extremes in the spectrum. At the one extreme, we'll have discretion. Let the policymakers decide what to do as the situation evolves. At the other extreme, we would have a very rigid rule. And a rule would tell us exactly how to respond under various circumstances. Right? A rule like the Taylor rule, for instance. Remember, the Taylor rule basically told us if we know what the inflation gap is and the output gap is, we know what we should set the nominal short-term interest rate at. So those we can think about as the kind of the two extremes. Now, there's a big argument against discretion. There's a lot of big arguments against discretion. Two of them that are particularly important. One is policymakers make mistakes. Right? We're all human. If the policymakers are using their discretion, maybe they just blew it. They didn't analyze the situation correctly, whatever it might be. But policymakers can make mistakes. The second big issue is what we refer to as the time inconsistency problem. The time inconsistency problem basically says you might have the appropriate policy for the short run. But if you maintain that policy for a longer period of time, you actually end up with worse long-run results. Worse long-run results. So should we worry then about the long-run outcomes, or should we worry about the short-run outcomes? If your short-run outcomes are bad outcomes, maybe you want to respond to those. But you also need to be cognizant of the fact that in the long run, you may have bad side effects. So think about this example. Suppose we have a negative short-run aggregate supply shock. Short-run aggregate supply curve shifts up. Higher inflation, lower economic output, higher unemployment. One of the things that we might decide to do is we don't like higher unemployment. So we might have an expansionary monetary and or fiscal policy, bringing the economy back to general equilibrium much more quickly. Well, if we do that, one of the things that we've seen before is you're going to end up with a permanently higher inflation rate. The right short-run policy, getting the unemployment rate down, might actually lead to a bad long-run outcome, permanently higher inflation. That's the time inconsistency problem. Okay. Now, how about rules? There are really two different kinds of rules. What we call non-activist or sometimes passive rules. These are rules that simply tell us exactly what to do. We don't have to think about anything. Right? So in this case, we might say something like, please don't break the furniture. So we might say something like, set the short-term interest rate at 4%. It's a rule. That's what we do. Right? So we're going to do whatever it is that we have to do to make sure that the short-run nominal interest rate is at 4%. Or we might say something along the lines, make the money supply grow by 3%. This was Milton Friedman suggested many decades ago. Right? So the money supply growth rate rule says 3%. The Fed does whatever they have to do, or the central bank does whatever they have to do in order to make sure that the money supply grows by 3%. It's non-activist in the sense that it doesn't require any decision-making by the central bankers, the policymakers. We can juxtapose that with activist rules. So activist rules actually says we are going to change something. It's not always going to be the same, but it's going to depend upon economic circumstances. The Taylor rule is a perfect example of that. Right? So the Taylor rule says look at the inflation gap, look at the unemployment gap. That'll tell you what short-term nominal interest rate should be. And if one of those gaps changes, then that also tells you need to change that short-run interest rate. So notice that it requires the central bank to actually do something other than maintaining a static situation, a fixed interest rate, a fixed exchange rate, the constant rate of growth of the money supply or the monetary base or whatever. So there's a plethora of activist rules. There's also a plethora of non-activist rules. The biggest case that can be made for rules is that it solves the time inconsistency problem if you set the rule for an optimal or preferred long-run outcome. Inflation targeting. We looked at that earlier. We saw that when faced with demand shocks in particular, if you're targeting inflation, you're going to end up with a steady inflation rate, and the economy is always going to go back to potential output and go back quickly. Even with a short-run aggregate supply shock, while you get bigger economic booms and recessions, you still end up back at potential output with a steady inflation rate. So in the long run, it works out quite well. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that it works out really well in the short run. So when you're using rules to solve the time inconsistency problem, you're basically saying that the long run is more important than the short run. And that may be true, unless in the short run, you're the one who's unemployed. Now, why would we be against rules? The Taylor rule seems to be a nice procedure for how to set short-term interest rates, so why might we be against them? The problem with rules is that we have to set them at a particular point in time, and we usually assume that the economy is operating normally. Well, what if it's not? What if something happens, like a huge financial crisis, 2008, 2009, that pushes the economy to an extreme side, one way or the other? Now what do? You had a multiple-choice question on problem set number 5 that asked you, what should the European Central Bank do with all of these inflation rates and output gaps and all of this stuff? What did it say to do? Set the short-term interest rate at -1. Short-term interest rates can't go below 0. Now we've got a rule that's broken. Right? We can't do what the rule says. So how do we deal with those kinds of conditions? What do we do with a rule that says do all this other kind of stuff, and then there's a massive earthquake in a small country, or a big war and rapid mobilization in a large country? Right? The rule cannot account for every conceivable possibility. So it's going to be very, very difficult for a simple rule to actually account for all the various things that might happen. Okay. A second thing that rules have difficulty doing, and that is incorporating things that we know about the economy that are not necessarily captured well in the data. Again, the Taylor rule is an interesting way to think about it. The Taylor rule is normally written so that it has the output gap in it. But remember, GDP is only reported out quarterly in the United States, and then it gets revised over the subsequent couple of months. So we don't really know what real GDP. We don't get the data very often, and it gets revised. So we don't have a high degree of confidence that we know what it is at any particular point in time. So the Taylor rule is often rewritten with the unemployment gap using Okun's law. But one of the things that we've seen recently, and that I alluded to just a few minutes ago, the unemployment rate has come down much more quickly than most people had expected. And it may be that it's coming down more quickly because the baby boom generation is moving into their mid-60s and exiting the labor force, moving into their retirement years. So that would reduce the size of the labor force, and for any given level of unemployment, then would make unemployed people would then be filling those jobs, so the unemployment rate can come down more quickly. So how do we deal with that? What do we get mixed signals on what's happening in the labor market? How do we figure out exactly what's going on? Even if we've got data, how do we deal with conflicting evidence? Again, a simple rule is not going to be able to really tell you that. Now, a third reason that we might be cautious about using rules is that we have an imperfect understanding of how the economy is structured, what its dynamic adjustment mechanism is, and in particular, the transmission mechanism from once monetary and fiscal policy are changed to when they actually impact the economy and how they impact the economy. Right? So our models, even though they seem to explain what's going on in the economy okay, what if the model that we have doesn't really reflect the real economy, the true economy? That is, we've got a model, but it's not the right model. So now what do? The policy rule that we've developed that works well in our model may, again, under particular circumstances, go haywire if the economy hits a special speed bump. Or we can think about adopting a rule, having exactly the right underlying model, and that might even be the true model of the economy, but then the economy changes. There's structural changes that come about that all of a sudden make the model not the appropriate model, which might mean the rule is no longer the appropriate rule. So an example. When Milton Friedman, using the quantity theory of money, came up with the 3% money growth rule, his thinking was the following. Velocity is constant. Real GDP, potential GDP, grows at 3% per year. So if I grow the money supply times velocity being a constant at 3%, then economic output times inflation should also be 3%. The economy's potential is growing at 3%, so inflation should be 0. And that's what he thought was an appropriate inflation rate. That seemed like a good idea when he announced it. The problem is, shortly after he announced it, we deregulated the financial sector, and velocity, go back and look at some of those charts, velocity started doing all sorts of things, up and down. So even though we had a good rule to begin with, or what seemed to be a good rule to begin with, under the appropriate assumptions, the structure of the economy changed so that a 3% money growth rule no longer works. Now what you need to get 0 inflation is that money supply times velocity